All right, everybody, welcome. We are live. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this really special event. We have 534 people here, which is really incredible, one of our biggest events ever. My name is Josh Meadow. I'm the COO of the Chacruna Institute, and I'm really, really pleased to be introducing today's event and welcoming you all here. Feel free to post in the chat where you're calling in from. We always have a really incredible international audience. I'm seeing already Amsterdam, Israel, France, Maine, California, so many different places. I'm here in San Francisco, California, and I'm just going to say a little bit of logistical introduction before bringing on our executive director, Bia Labate, to introduce Chacruna and today's event. So this platform, Crowdcast, it automatically records this event, so you'll be able to view the recording as soon as we're done right here at the same link. So if you miss anything, the recording will be available right here. We're going to go for about 2 hours, and we're going to have the last 30 to 45 minutes available for audience Q&A. So if you want to ask questions, you can use a special feature. There's a button that says Ask a Question. So feel free to post your questions there, and you can also vote and comment on your favorite questions, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Yeah, please use the chat to share where you're calling from and comment about the event. Please try to keep the chat relevant to the event and not self-promotional, nothing too disrespectful or overly aggressive. We will be keeping an eye on that, and we just ask that you please keep it respectful and polite. We have we just posted in the chat our next event next week. It's actually that's today's event, Glauber. So the next week's event is the one on ayahuasca legalization, new developments. And so you can check that out, and you can check all of our upcoming events and our previous recordings at the link there in the chat. I also really recommend checking out our membership if you're interested in what we do and wanting to join our inner circle and get more involved in the Chacruna community. Please have a look at the link in the chat or the button here at the bottom of the screen to become a member. And we have member-only events and online Discord community and lots of other great stuff. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to our wonderful executive director, Dr. Bia Labate, to share a bit more. Welcome, Bia.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Ohlone territory, Bay Area, my beloved new home in the United States of America. And so I'm very excited to have this event today because the topic of women is dear to my heart. Chacruna was co-founded by my partner, Clancy Kavner, and I. So a queer couple where women and, in Chacruna, we value women leadership and love guys that are okay with that and that help empower us and give visibility to us and step down and let women have leadership. And we're also doing a lot of work on this front. We're proudly hosting a Women in Psychedelics history, Women in Psychedelics series in our Chacruna Chronicles with Dr. Erica Dick. She's from Canada, and we are, I think, nearly 50 posts. We have been doing this once a week for the last several months. In this post, we're trying to give visibility, platform, empower the voices of women, starting with historical looks on how women played a fundamental role in the researchers in the 50s and 60s that often is not acknowledged, is not perceived. So women were present frequently as caretakers, holding the hands and cleaning the vomit and taking notes and having intellectual conversations and reflections and producing knowledge, participating on the creation of protocols, but hardly ever their names appear as authors of the publications. And if anything, a lot of women, remember the 50s more traditional family models women were there supporting their husbands, and not less important, supporting their fear to take psychedelics and to do this kind of innovative research. So that's just one tiny example of how women have played important roles in care and in science, and in spirituality that often comes unacknowledged. So today we are celebrating us, women, and our role in the psychedelic renaissance. But we're not just celebrating women in general and in vague and abstract forms. We're also celebrating and cheering and clapping and being fans of women that are trying to lead nonprofit organizations. It's a truly heroic act to have a nonprofit organization in the midst of this explosion of millions of dollars and so many sharks and opportunists and new players and fake experts coming to the field of psychedelics and wanting to make the best buck the quickest way possible, and all this emergent of this 1 million conferences and publications and businesses that are just appearing by the second out of the blue and with profit motives, and frequently not so caring about the psychedelic movement and how we came to the point that we are now here. So we got a lot of respect for people that are doing for-profit, that are doing nonprofit work. Of course, there's a lot of for-profit things that are entirely legitimate. But here we're talking about women that are leading modest nonprofits, trying to become sustainable and trying to make a dream, invent a future, not have a regular job, but instead dedicate our lives and careers and heart and vision and soul to building things that we believe just by ideological principle that they're good. And that's what my friend Anya is doing. And here we created this event. I want to be upfront with everybody. This is a fundraising event. So please get ready to donate. We're trying to support the Psychedelic Renaissance documentary that she's the leader of, and her team led by women. So we are really tired of also just kissing the ass of big, powerful, rich white men. Of course, we want to be friends to all of them, but the idea is that this project is led by women, and we are a network of women calling each other in support, our sisterhood, our partnership, our virtual communities, our global hearts, and our visions, our souls, our hopes for creating awesome things. And despite all the challenges and the craziness of being alive in this COVID times, in this convoluted planet, we still have a lot of really good people trying to do a lot of good work. And this event is aimed to fundraising to support Anya and her team. And for that, we called a bunch of really important and influential women that we also respect and are also part of our networks of friendship, of care, of sisterhood and compassion and love and unity. So everybody, we have almost 550 people. If everybody donates 10, 15, 20, 100, I'm not going to say how much that arrives to because I'm not so good in math, but certainly it's going to be a good help. We have, Anya has created a GoFund campaign to us. And so we're trying to create transversal, vertical, horizontal, other networks of connections so we can fund our work, because a lot of people might have ideas top down. Oh, we should do this, and this is what's good. A lot of donors or philanthropists have good intentions, but are not real experts and are not grounded in the community and don't really know the work from bottom up. And so the small grassroots nonprofits know what they're doing, are down in the community doing the work every day. And so we are here supporting and celebrating our friends across the ocean in the UK and our global connections to all of these wonderful people. I very much appreciate and respect all of you and feel so grateful to have such a great audience. And with that, I call Anya to lead this incredible conversation with us. Much love. Big hug from the Bay Area.
Thank you, Bia. Thank you for having us. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and see so many people. I'm actually quite shocked that we have so many. And I have some really amazing and inspiring women with me tonight to talk about really, really important issues that we all care about. But before we go there, I'm just going to briefly talk about the documentary because it's almost 4 years and 3 days ago, I think. I was sitting at Breaking Convention on the grass and thinking, wow, what an amazing movement it is. I definitely need to document it. And then I was thinking, oh, but it would cost so much money and take so much time. I'm never going to manage to do it. And there we are today. Documentaries filmed. There's 4 years of footage, or just like following people and how their opinions of psychedelics change and how psychedelic renaissance was changing. And this like documentary evolved together with the movement, which is pretty beautiful. What it was supposed to be in the beginning and what it is now is completely different story, I suppose. So it's labor of love. I've spent 4 years filming, my own time volunteering. There's about 6-7 other people who like volunteering time behind the scenes with me. And at the moment we have it all filmed, but we do need to finish editing, and we need to pay for animations to make it really compelling and beautiful, so it speaks to everyone, not just people who like psychedelics, but also to mothers, fathers, and just normal public. So if you guys can help us, then really please just donate to our campaign. Anything, even like $5 actually helps us so much, because if 20 people put $5 there, then it's obviously more dollars. I'm really bad with math as well. Anyways, so what I'm trying to say, please support. And also, I understand if you don't have money, but then please share our campaign on social media and just like give a shout everywhere to your friends, to your family who can support us. Thank you so much. I'm going to put the link to the campaign again. And without further ado, we can have a chat with those wonderful women that are here today. So I suppose to start question, I just want to do a bit of introduction, but actually would like you to just tell us who you are and what got you to psychedelic renaissance and to working with altered states of consciousness. Maybe Akua, can you go first?
Hello, everybody. So excited to be here and really excited to support this film because it really mirrors my own journey into psychedelics. Anya and I actually met behind my house. I think it was 2 days after I'd had Cambo. So I was really just feeling amazing. And I saw this, I thought she was about 16. Girl with a big bag, and I just went up to her and said, "Are you lost?" And she was coming to my house to film my mum for somebody else. And I think my journey with psychedelics is really that's how it's been every time I've needed something. But I'm a dressmaker, and I got interested in this when my son became involved with, in England we have a thing called county lines drug dealing, where young people are taken across county lines to sell drugs. And in an effort to become strong, I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but that's what happened in the end. And psychedelics were also what were able to get my son out of that whole story. And that's been a 4-year journey as well. So 4 seems to be very important somehow. So that's me.
Thank you, Akua. I'm just going to go with clockwise from my screen. Go, could you please go next? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Anya, for including me in this. And I'm really looking forward to actually hearing what everybody has to say. My name is Dolen. I am an associate professor of neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University. My introduction to psychedelics actually was when I was an undergraduate. I had designed my own major. I was studying comparative perspectives on the mind. I was really interested in consciousness. And I was really sort of leaning towards a philosophy-focused major. And then I took this class called Drugs, Brain, and Behavior, which was, about 50% of the class was, eager beaver pre-medical students who were trying to understand, something better and get a leg up for pharmacology when they were in medical school. And the other half of the class were sort of people who had experienced psychedelics in a recreational setting and just wanted to understand more. And for me, I was sort of a little bit of both of those things. And for me, I just remember being so astonished when I saw side by side the molecule of LSD with the molecule of serotonin. And to me, this was, absolutely just the best day, because I remember thinking, oh my God, all these hard problems of consciousness, of understanding that, feel like we're never going to be able to solve. Psychedelics are going to be, the way that we're going to be able to understand these big things that, traditional neuroscience hasn't really been able to tackle. And so that was it. I decided to become a neuroscientist. I was very excited about that. But at the time, psychedelics were not considered sort of a serious pursuit for an academic neuroscientist. So, I kind of put it in the background, and I was interested in it, and I kept, kind of a vague tab on things, but I didn't really pursue it. And then years later, like 20 years later, I started my own lab finally after, finishing graduate school and medical school and postdoc and doing all kinds of other research on synaptic plasticity and critical periods and autism. I decided to start, when I started my own lab, that I really wanted to come back to this idea of psychedelics. And so I sort of came back in just, I think, at the start of the Renaissance, kind of appreciating that things have shifted and that once again, this is a acceptable. I mean, it was still painfully difficult to get funding from the NIH because it was still considered outside of, the realm of, acceptable research. But I feel like now things are really moving and changing, and it's just such an exciting time to be doing this type of research.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And our last speaker, Rose.
Thank you, Anya. So yes, I was just thinking actually, like Akua said, about how the journey kind of it's just this kind of river of like the right people turning up at the right time. And it was just like, it's been such a whirlwind because since the moment of kind of like entering the psychedelic river, it just kind of, it's been an amazing process of things just flowing naturally. But it started when I was doing my undergraduate degree, because I was studying English literature at a time when magic mushrooms were legal in the UK. So I lived in a house of 8 women, 8 students, and our flat was above the magic mushroom shop. So we had the kind of really interesting experience of exploration as young women, exploring, learning about each other. So we had kind of informal group psychedelic therapy in our kind of younger years. So other people were out kind of drinking a lot of beer and doing lots of kind of sports initiations, and we were kind of sitting in circles talking about our mothers eating legal magic mushrooms. Those are the days. But then in terms of the research, so then, long period of time went by, trained as a clinical psychologist, the mushrooms became illegal. And then my best friend had suffered from depression since we were quite young, and she tried all the kind of, like talking therapy and that kind of thing. It hadn't really helped her. And then she went to do an ayahuasca retreat, and it just kind of, really like, she came back kind of full power when she arrived back home. And so then I was really interested in it, but I was I was working in the NHS as a clinical psychologist, so I was so busy because you work these really, really long hours. You see like 7 or 8 patients a day. So I was just too exhausted to really kind of do the reading and get into it. It's hard when you've got a full-time job and you're tired to like have an interest outside it. But then I went on maternity leave, and it was actually the experience of being up at night, breastfeeding and not having to work, that I started Googling things, and I found out that there was a psilocybin study that was happening just down the road, psilocybin for depression. And it was one of those things with the flow. So I emailed them saying, I'm on maternity leave, I'm a psychologist. And they replied saying, we need a psychologist, we need a female psychologist, like now, can you please come like tomorrow? And so I just literally turned up and they were like, right, there you go. There's a room with someone having psilocybin session. Can you sit there? And it was literally as simple as that. So yeah, and then that's where it all began. So yeah.
This is great. So this story is in my documentary, but the magic mushroom story, studying and stuff, is not. So you owe me, it's a great story. But I must say, I remember when magic mushrooms were legal in UK, because I remember I came here for holidays and I thought, what a great country, I have to move here. And I actually moved to London 3 months later. So there you go. Because of mushrooms, I'm here 16 years later, still, maybe even longer than 16. Anyways, so let's dive into my questions. So you know how this documentary is, there are men in it, but it's mostly, I think 90%, like most of the team is all female, all the crew is female. We have a random guy in the team, but they have small role. They do our social media very greatly. But also in terms of protagonists, the contributors, like we have more women than men, and it's quite unusual. In film is also similar, like more men do that. And also you see that across the whole psychedelic field, obviously, there's more men than women. So why do you think there's such a gender disparity in this field of psychedelics? Anyone who feels compelled, let's go popcorn style.
I mean, I guess
I
for
often
me,
wondered about this because
the distribution of men and women in psychedelics, in psychedelic science, is not really that different from the rest of neuroscience, right? So it's basically the same, right? I go to meetings and typically it's 90% at the speakers and faculty and, at the leadership roles, it's usually about 10%, 90%. And sometimes, if they've made a really strong effort, it'll be 20%. And so, I think that the thing that's different about the psychedelics community is that I think that people who, at least psychedelic scientists, think of themselves as particularly enlightened group of people. And so I think they really are very surprised when you point out that, well, actually, you're not that much different from, the rest of society in terms of your appreciation of this disparity. And I think that this actually brings up something very important about psychedelics, right? Like there is something, about the psychedelic experience that, that William James described as the noetic experience that I sort of think of more as a confirmation bias. And this kind of gets into, sort of how we think the psychedelics are working is that you come out of it believing that you have had a very profound experience and that you have seen the true truth. And that, I think, can very much be true, especially if you had, a very deep mystical experience. But I also think that if you go into a psychedelic experience and you believe, or even if you are not aware that you believe in a certain set of truths, right? A certain religious background, a certain philosophical background, a certain sort of psychological background, and you don't have anything challenging that belief system while you are having the psychedelic journey, then you come out of the psychedelic journey believing that truth ever more strongly, right? And because it feels like a powerful truth, a first, like, oh my God, this is the real reality that I didn't even know I knew, right? And I think that this has infected sort of psychedelic science in the way that, if you ask psychedelic neuroscientists, what do you think about psychedelics? If you have a Freudian psychologist, he tells you a story about, ego dissolution and, uses fMRI imaging to tell you about, how that happens. And then if you talk to, somebody from the Good Friday experiment, they tell you, oh, well, I saw God and I saw really, really God. And if you talk to a Freudian psychologist, a Jungian, they tell you, oh, well, the woman is void. And I saw the blackness that is woman void, and if you are a neuroscientist like me, I am not, immune to this. I come out of a psychedelic experience and I'm like, all of consciousness comes down to molecules. I knew it, right? And so this confirmation bias, I think, is part of the reason why this habit of excluding women, of sexism, has persisted despite the fact that there is, this feeling of enlightenment following psychedelics. So that's sort of my take on why it persists and why it's not that different from the rest of society.
Thank you so much. Rose, did you have something to follow up?
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think also what's interesting is that we found in psychedelic research that most of the applicants for the studies were also male. Overwhelmingly white men applied to take part in psilocybin studies, which also kind of interested me. So I was like, okay, so many of the professionals, like the scientists, the researchers, are male, white males, and many of the participants in the research, or the applicants for the research, are also white males. What's going on here? So I did wonder whether there was something going on around, I don't know, it gets into a really kind of deeper conversation, but something about privilege because of drug associations. It made me feel that, if you're in a community where you get stopped and searched a lot for if a lot of people in your community have, drugs become a real problem. People get prison sentences, people get stopped and searched for drugs. For example, Black communities, you're much less likely to be gung-ho about, oh yeah, I'm going to go and do this psychedelic study, because the stigma is great and it's harder to put yourself in that position. So I think it felt to me like there was something in a way about, kind of being able to explore this avenue. Even as a researcher, being able to go down a psychedelic path, when I first did, however many years ago, there was some stigma and I got lots of raised eyebrows, but there was something about, and I'm a woman, but I'm a white woman, and I felt like I kind of could, because of that privilege and sense of I feel like this is something I'm going to be able to do without suffering terrible kind of consequences. So I think it's complicated. It's privilege, it's gender, and it's also race, I think, all come into the picture.
Akua, did you have anything to follow up?
No, I think the ladies said it all, really. I think it's very hard to break out of these molds that we've all been brought up in. It's probably going to take a lot more psychedelics and then maybe reading philosophy and getting into metaphysics before we really break out of the binds that we tie ourselves up in, for sure.
Definitely. It's also obviously, because we know there were women in the 60s and 70s doing this, and we don't actually read about them. I know some names, but everybody knows the guys, everybody will wake up in the middle of the night, Timothy Leary, yes.
Yeah.
And not necessarily all the women. And I'm just for us, it's lack of representation. And I meet a lot of young women who want to work in science, and they're just scared because they were not given women as a scientist as an example, and like, oh, am I good enough? You know, am I gonna manage with this competitiveness of men? So that's what I see around young women. But I suppose that leads me to a question: did you ever experience any discrimination because of your gender or your ethnicity, or in work? Well, in work, in psychedelic kind of field. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Anybody? Ross?
Yeah.
Ross, sorry.
Yeah. And it's hard to talk about, actually. It's hard to talk about because it feels very, it feels kind of somehow kind of ungrateful, or like, I don't know, it's hard. But yes, so I don't think I even realized I had, well, I kind of did, but I think academia as well, just generally, as a woman, it might be harder to, that whole thing about women not getting credit for their work and their names not going on things. So I've been really, like you say, with the women in the 60s or the 50s that contributed huge chunks of the model that we use now in psychedelic therapy. Huge chunks of it came from women, like Joyce Martin was one, for example. It's a name that probably nobody knows, but women that really kind of like steered the direction, and actually steered the direction away from quite kind of cold models where people got left on their own in a room, sometimes strapped to a bed. And it tended to be the women that said, oh, I think a loving presence is actually really important. I think music's really important. So women tended to bring in the more kind of caring elements, but their names didn't get, they didn't get reference for their work, and they didn't get remembered. And I think I've seen that happen a lot, and I've experienced that happening to me. And I've really, really tried to fight to get my name on things and to not let that happen. And it feels so uncomfortable because you feel like a complete narcissist / bully / you get all these cultural kind of representations of women that are bossy, that kind of demand their name on things. So an example of it was that after many years of having my work not referenced to me in various different ways, in ways that was extremely frustrating, I developed a psychometric measure for measuring connectedness to self, other, and world. And I decided to call it, because of my experiences of constantly kind of losing my work to other people, I decided to call it after myself. I said, I'm going to call it the What's Connectedness Scale, because I'm a woman, because women don't get represented very often, because I'm a woman doing this, I'm going to call it after myself because I'm a woman and I want to not lose this. But the response from someone in the lab, a man, was, don't you think it's a bit narcissistic to call it after yourself? And I was just like, that really names the dilemma, because I'm kind of fighting for other women to try and not let that be okay, that we don't get our names on things, but then constantly feel like I'm being it's hard.
I think we need to talk to Kelvin, Celsius, Fahrenheit, and all those dudes, and tell them it was quite narcissistic to name things after themselves. Brilliant. Akua or Gu, do you have any stories to share about this question?
I think it's so different for someone like me because I don't work in science. And so, and I think I've been such a hippie for so long, and that, I see sometimes when the conversation goes a certain way, and I might talk about chakras or I talk about psychedelics, and people look at me funny, but I don't mind anymore because these are my reality. And, you kind of, it's helped me build a much thicker skin to be able to, and I work for myself, so I don't have to, I think it's such a different world when your daily bread comes from somebody else. Someone can look at me any way they want to look at me, but when I'm back in my workshop, I'm responsible for my earnings. So, the power is so different, very different.
Your own boss, best way.
Mm.
Oh, yes. Yes, it's definitely different. Academia, obviously, big struggle. Gul, did you have any stories to share about this?
I mean, I have so many stories. I could take up 3 or 4 hours and we could do a mini series just on, my stories, right? And so So instead of kind of regaling you with those individual events, I will just say that, I think that there's a wonderful book, which I highly, highly recommend, by Carolyn Criado Perez, called Invisible Women. And she talks about how, and it's different from most of the other books of feminism that I read. It's not about like how you feel about women or how confident women are or how, we're represented. I think all of those things are important parts of the conversation. But what she really focuses in on is the way that women are systematically erased from society by not including them in studies, by not even acknowledging that the world was built for men, right? That scissors, hand tools are hard for us to open bottles because they were designed around the size of man's hands, right? Or, the fact that, there's a bias in publishing where, and this has been studied over and over and over again. You can have a Nature paper, and if you're a woman, it will get cited less than the exact same paper, Nature, same time and same subject as a man, right? And this is just these ways of not only not acknowledging women, but then removing them, historically erasing them from the record. And this happens not just because of bias, because we're not well represented in movies. I call it the sort of Princess Leia problem, but I can tell you about what that is in a second. But it's also because, we are given less money and less power, and that inability to sort of set up our own trusts and our own, museums that takes care of our papers and make sure that those, journals that we wrote, while we were on the Beagle ended up in a, museum in London, right? Those kinds of things also have a cumulative effect. And so I think it's a wonderful book, and I don't think that any of the critiques she makes of science and math and the internet and city planning and jarred, design, or, psychedelics as a community is not exempt from any of these kinds of critiques. And I just wanted to pick up one more thing on something that Roz said, which I think is like hugely important, especially as we start thinking about, collecting data from women. One of the other things that in this book, in this Invisible Woman book, she talks about is that when a woman gets married, her number of hours that she has to herself for, secondary class drops by 6 hours on average a week, whereas a man gains 30 minutes. So it's not even, and I don't know where the missing time goes, but like, it is not that surprising to me that men have more leisure time to sit and spend 8 hours on a psychedelic, right? And having leisure time to process that psychedelic so that it becomes a powerful experience for them that makes them want to know more, devote more time to, participating in trials. And so these are sort of the systematic hidden ways I think that women lose out on public conversations, being part of a public research, all of those structural things that end up having a cumulative effect that we need to care about.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing this.
And can I give you another example? I just thought of something. Seeing this is
just to say, we don't hate men, and everybody in the audience, we do like you. We're just complaining about the men who take all the space.
This is the thing, we so rarely get an opportunity to have this conversation. I'm enjoying it so much. I'm getting over enthusiastic. Just to keep on giving examples. But just one more that I think is, worth saying, because it happened the other day. So the psilocybin for depression study that just finished at Imperial was run by a group of 5 women and 1 man, our amazing lead psychiatrist, Johnny Martel, and 5 of us women that were there all day, every day for like over a year, pretty much lived in the study, completely devoted every part of ourselves to that for like a year and a half, really. 5 women. And then recently I saw a summary of the the findings of the article. It was a summary for a blog, like a mental health blog. And it was written by a male psychiatrist, just giving a summary of the study. And his summary of our study had probably about 12 references, all men, not a single one. I was the clinical lead of the study and I wrote the therapy protocol. I wasn't referenced a single time. My name was not anywhere there. None of my colleagues, my female colleagues, the whole thing looked, it had been done by another man who hadn't actually stepped foot in the study site for the whole study. And yeah, not only that, but there was no women references through the whole thing. So it was extraordinary. I mean, it's outrageous. It's kind of flawed, isn't it? But like it just passes as the norm. And when I read it, I was like, ah, and I wanted to, but there's nothing you can do. It's just like, that's the way the system works. So you have to go, oh, so our work for a year and a half has now been just referenced to men. And that's just the way it is. Yeah.
This is shocking. It's just, I'm a bit speechless, but yeah. I'm so sorry this happened to you, and it should not happen to anyone. And it's just outrageous, basically.
Thank you.
So just wanted to go back a bit to, we're talking about your study, Ross, that most of the participants were male, and we're talking about a lot of researchers being male. So how this lack of female representation affects the psychedelic research itself? Are we missing something there? I mean, we have women in, but maybe not enough. So is the conversation balanced, or maybe it's not?
No.
No answer.
No.
It's, huh?
I feel like I've been talking too much. Ghoul, you probably answered this better than me.
Well, it's hard for me to know specifically with psychedelics, because in our research, the paper, the Nature paper that we had, we did look in female and male mice, and the response to psychedelics and the outcome measure that we used was the same. So we don't have any evidence that psychedelic responses are different in the male versus the female mice, but that's not always the case. We certainly have other studies where there are differences. And again, I'm sorry to keep harping on about the Criado Perez book, but it's really so prescient to this conversation. I mean, she talks about how, and I remember this when I was in medical school, we would learn things like, the typical response, typical symptoms of heart attack include, pain in the arm, pressing an elephant down. And then there are these atypical heart attack symptoms, which, don't present like that. They're more generalized dull ache. Well, it turns out those atypical responses are not atypical at all. They are typical for 51% of the population. They are the female, response. And this is why, and this has consequences, because this is why women, although they are less likely to have a heart attack, are more likely to die from a heart attack because they are underdiagnosed. People don't recognize the symptoms. And so it's much further along on the clinical path before they get to the point of saying, oh, this is a heart attack. We need to do this panel of screens. We need to get them in the OR. We need to, make this happen, right? But there are other reasons as well, which, you can read the book and hear about the fascinating heart attack story. But it's also the case that we might be missing therapeutic opportunities by not studying women, right? There may be some things that, don't really work that well in men, but that actually work great for women, right? And we may also be missing, therapeutic windows, right? So like, women, for example, we've heard a lot in psychedelics recently about, changes in plasticity and, dendritic spine morphology, these kinds of changes. Well, guess what? Women have those kinds of morphological changes in their neurons every month. There's a massive sprouting of synapses, and then they get cold. And, if you're one of those women who's had a baby, maybe you're familiar with this pregnancy brain phenomenon where you can't really seem to remember. And some people think that this has to do with these fluctuations in, being able to make and, consolidate new memories. And that's a good thing. And so it might be that we need to pay attention to the similarities between these natural rhythms. And, maybe women are in some sense already sort of more able to recognize the psychedelic experience because they're having a mild version of it, once every 28 days, who knows? I mean, I'm not saying that's a theory. I'm just suggesting that there are potentially many other avenues that have been left unexplored by not studying these effects in women as well.
Totally. What you were saying just a bit earlier in the beginning of answering this question also made me think about autism, right? That is like a lot of women go undiagnosed because all the rules about how to diagnose people were based on men, right? Is that correct?
Well, that one's a little bit trickier because it turns out that this is a little known fact, but actually, if you measure IQ across males and females, female IQ is just a little bit higher on average than male IQ. And that is thought to be because females have 2 X chromosomes, whereas males have 1. And for reasons that we don't really understand, the chromosome that has the mutation on it tends to be the one that's inactivated. So it's like a compensatory mechanism. And it turns out, for reasons that we also don't really understand, but probably have to do with evolution, that many of the brain genes ended up on the X chromosome. And so there's this slight increase in intellectual disability in males compared to females. And autism, although everybody thinks of, Rain Man and savantism, is actually 70% of the people have intellectual disability. And it's funny, actually, that specific example is especially prescient to this conversation because in the early 1900s, when this was first noticed, that there were more men in the asylums for the intellectually disabled than there were women. The explanation that was given at the time is that, well, women are, not expected to do very much, so they're kind of dumber. And so if they have intellectual disability, then as a woman, you're much less likely to get institutionalized for it. That was the explanation that they gave for this. And at that time, we didn't know about chromosomes. We didn't know about, double chromosomes and X inactivation and the protective effects of estrogen. We didn't know any of those things. So, it does seem to be the case that autism, the most common cause of autism is Fragile X. The most common identified cause is Fragile X, and that's on the X chromosome. And there are many other causes like that. So it's a little bit trickier to say that the male-female difference there is because of ascertainment bias. It might actually reflect a biological reality about neuroprotective effects of having 2 X chromosomes.
Whoa, amazing stuff. We love neuroscience. Rose, did you want to add to that one about, let me remind you.
I was just going to say that we did actually in the second study have way more women than we did in the first. So the first psilocybin for depression study was mostly men. The second study we did really try and get a more diverse sample. We didn't do very well in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of gender, we did. And one thing that we really wanted to do, but we didn't kind of really end up fully getting the data for, was looking at the menstrual cycle and where women were, our participants were on their cycle, and how that might affect their experience of psilocybin, which I think is such a huge, that's a whole other topic of conversation, is how little our culture recognizes the menstrual cycle in half the population, literal, people have different experiences of it. And obviously people in menopause aren't menstruating anymore. So not 50%, but I don't know what percentage, but a good chunk of the population and also not children. Still a good chunk of the population at any one time are going through like 1 week a month where you literally like, it's, you know, every month it's like terrible. It's really, really hard to do things normally. We really need to come to a point where we can have a more flexible kind of understanding of that, where we talk about it more and where there's more flexibility around it. Because yeah, it's incredible that if men menstruated and women didn't menstruate, we'd see so many products for it. We'd have a whole working system would be all structured around making sure they had a week off in their month. Everything would be completely different if men menstruated and women didn't. So yeah, we need to change that around, I think. But we also need to study menstruation, like in terms of drug effects. And that's coming next, I think.
Akua, did I see you raising your...
Yes, yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, it's so interesting. I hadn't kind of thought about this until now, but, you know, right now I think we're coming up to the new moon. My crown is so activated, my solar plexus are so activated. And as you're speaking, you know, I don't even know myself, what would it be like to actually trip when so many things are actually going on? And every month I say I must look and find out the date for the new moon and the full moon, but I never have to, because this thing happens and then it's like I'm wearing a cap, you know, for about 3-4 days, twice a month. When I had periods, at least I was only once a month. Now I don't have periods, but I have this crown thing going on, and that's now twice a month. And I know that my insights are more during these times, and synchronicities are more during these times. And the field also opens up in ridiculous ways during these times. So, I mean, Rosalind, you know, this is a thing to study. I think there's something really in there with psychedelics and the female cycle. And I was just thinking of the work of that guy, he's called Tarnis, who also talks about the planets and the transits of the planets and how that affects consciousness and psychedelics. I mean, there's some amazing things still left to be looked at, I think, for sure.
Somebody in the audience just said menopause as well. That would be also
interesting.
Yeah.
How women are after menopause and before and during how, because you know you have.
I would just also add that, you know, women aren't just like more complicated, mysterious creatures. They're just different. So men also cycle, and their cycle is as extreme as our menstrual cycle, except it happens on a 24-hour cycle rather than a 28-day cycle, right? So men's peak hormone levels fluctuate within a 24-hour day dramatically, right? And so, you know, they're not like simpler versions, and that's why we should study them. They're just complicated in a different way, you know, right? I mean, no, because this has often been the justification for not studying women, has been like, oh, well, it's just too complicated. That's just crazy complicated, and it's just too expensive to study women. We'll never understand it. Let's go for the easy experiment with men. That's the justification, right? So I just kind of want to make sure that we're not, you know, making that argument here.
Okay. I'm always thinking about being a guide and having period or PMSing.
Oh my God.
How does this work?
It's an absolute nightmare. Like an absolute nightmare. So yeah, you're literally sitting there all day. You can't really leave. And I mean, this is the thing that doesn't get spoken about periods so much, but like, it's really hard when you're on a heavy day. Like you really seriously like need a bathroom closer. You need to be able to do that. So like, yeah, it was really hard. And it's like, because you have to be so present for that person through their experience, and you have to be so present, and you never know at what parts of their journey they might need something. So it's not about you at all. So you just have to like hope that you're not going to really need to go to the bathroom at the same time that they're going to need you. So you kind of just have to like have the paracetamol, have the moon cup, and everything else, like all the layers, double up.
How do you deal with irritability though? Because obviously
Well,
there's that is what I'm asking here. Like I'm like a witch.
well, I know, me too. The one thing I did find actually is that I am also turned into a complete beast, like the few days before my period, like really badly. But one thing I did find actually is that when you're in a psychedelic session as a guide, the person's experience is so compelling that I would be irritable at the person in the shop on the way in, and I'd be irritable with this. But with that person going through the experience, there is something so beautiful and sacred and some incredibly moving about what they're going through, that all of that just goes to the side, and it's actually quite a nice relief from your own irritability, because it kind of pales, like any little things you might be irritated by just pale in comparison to what they're kind of going through. So I would find that it was like almost like a treatment for my own irritability when I had PMT. But then
I just want to add one more, sort of build on something that both Akua and Roz said about how we are in the world and what's considered normal. I mean, Roz, you mentioned this, like, can you imagine if the world were if men had periods, right? But I would frame it maybe slightly differently and say, can you imagine if the world were built around women's lives, right? If the structure of our weekday was more around a woman, right? So instead of taking 2 days off every week, we took 6 days off every month, and we worked continuously, right? So maybe all of these things that we have come to accept as like our crankiness before our period are just because we are trying to adapt our rhythms to the masculine rhythm, right? And we are trying to take our rest at the time that makes the most sense for men to take the rest, which is at the end of the week, which is instead of taking it at the end of the month. And so, because maybe we were meant to sort of work through the weekends for, whatever, 22 days of the month, and then just take a whole week off. And then maybe we wouldn't be irritated at all, right? Maybe we'd just be like, I'm healing, I am phoenixing right now, and this is my moment of rebirth, and I'm about to have like some crazy insights, and everybody would kind of stop and wait for the insights rather than just kind of get out of her way. She's cranky today,
Exactly. I must say, we have my team at Psychedelic Society is very, they're very good with, the guys are very good with women talking about their periods at the team meetings. And each time we have a check-in, there's at least one of us. So it's great. But then the guys know not to bother that person too much, give them space and allow them to cry, because it's completely okay to cry about everything, even if the new logo is not great, or there was a upsetting email or things like that. Those are emotional things at work for sure. So yes, if any guys from my workplace watch it, I love you guys. You're the best co-workers. So right, we talked a lot about women. I want to move now from this important subject. It was great. We have to have another event about this, just about cycles and things. Definitely on my agenda now to do at Psychedelic Society. And I want to talk to you about the Psychedelic Renaissance now. And we're going to talk about hopes and worries, as usually. But let's start with what's good about the Psychedelic Renaissance, mainstreaming and accessibility. What are the good things? Akua, can I ask you to maybe jump in first?
Yes, I think for me, what's been really good is just because of the internet. I think it's just made such a big difference. If I think of my own journey, really the start of my journey was, I don't want to take antidepressants. What can I take that's natural? And literally it, was St. John's wort, then Cambo, then Iboga, and then magic mushrooms. And because of the internet, and I always say Uncle Google and Auntie YouTube were just, it just brought everything that I needed. And then, of course, Audible, all the books I could ever want to listen to were just there. So I could get really good, deep information. Within 24 hours, you've consumed somebody's, 5 years worth of work, and you've just listened to that in 6 hours, 7 hours. So I think the internet has made it so that if you're that way inclined, if you're interested in radical self-responsibility, then you can find out about these compounds, you can find out about these medicines, and you can take your health in your hands. You know, at the moment, I look at all the trials and everything that's going on, and I think they're brilliant. And I know there's a lot of worry about whether, you know, companies are going to patent things. But what I think is we are also free to make choices, to make decisions, and go out and do what we know is best for our lives, and, you know, hang the law. So I'm kind of on that tip, really. Find out the information, do what you need to do for yourself, but take responsibility. And if it goes wrong, well, it went a bit wrong that time. But I'm super excited by what's happening. And yeah, this new psychedelic renaissance, I'm so pleased to be alive at this time, really. I don't think we could have had this kind of 25, 30 years ago, just because of the ease of finding out about all of these things at the moment. On the negative side is the cost.
No, we'll talk about this later. We're talking
Okay,
about good
cool.
things now.
The good things first.
I just
Excellent.
wanted to also mention that, because you told me this cool story one day, that through this Renaissance and you experiencing it, you actually found out that your ancestors were doing
Yes.
Tell me a tiny bit about it.
Yeah, that was just so kind of fascinating, because my little brother, 46 years old, but 3 years ago, he I suppose they would call it like a shamanic emergency. He suddenly started finding out he had all these healing gifts, which was in line with my mum's sister was a healer. But what we found out as I worked more with the medicines and talked more with other relatives about things that I was seeing, things that he was seeing, we found out that we've actually had traditional African priests or shamans going back 500 years. Very easy to trace. They're all, their names are there. But because of Christianity, there'd just been this kind of glossing it all over. But now that the medicines have been introduced into our family again, it's all emerging. And I just need to add that it's not even being introduced in terms of everybody's tripping. We have someone who actually has pneumonia. She gets pneumonia a lot, and she microdoses at night, and her lungs are clear. We have someone who was early onset of Alzheimer's. She microdoses at night, and her memories come back. You know, it's not just great big trips. There's just, so for me, I'm just kind of like, I can't see the downside yet.
So your Renaissance was not only in science and research, but also kind of psychedelic Renaissance in your family, in a way.
100%.
And how many people from Black community are completely removed from that past because of Christianity and because of the stigma of police and scare? So
totally.
This is kind of, that's a big part that maybe more people will come out actually and be more interested, right?
Well, this is why I'm always happy to go anywhere to, you know, to talk about how it helped us. I mean, you know, as we speak, I would say my son is now, I would say the last 3 conversations I've had with my son, I would say he is back and beyond anything I ever thought possible in terms of coming back to himself as a person. And his best friend, whose mother I tried to tell very, very sensitively about psychedelics, because I didn't know where she stood. And also I didn't want to be arrested when I knew I had a mission to save my son. And she didn't get it, and she wasn't interested. And the sad thing is, my son's best friend is in a psychiatric hospital because he was not able to get out of the gangs and the drug selling and get out of the trauma that these young people are in, because nobody really talks about them as actually suffering from PTSD, which they are. And it's taken a year of constant work since my son did MDMA and magic mushrooms for him to break the cycle. It still took a year for him to start having what I would call independent power thoughts. It's taken that long to come out of the hold. And so I'm always everywhere just saying to my community and working class people and women and everybody, you know, take your health into your own hands, you know, take your psychological state, your mental state into your own hands and look for what can help and work for you. Because if you're waiting for somebody else to make things all right for you, you could be waiting all day, if not all your life.
Especially, yeah, if we're waiting on NHS, then definitely wait for it. I'm sorry, NHS is a National Health Service in the UK.
Yeah.
And literally, like, you can wait forever for help. It's not possible to get it. It's ridiculous, basically.
Yeah.
It's shambolic. But I know probably
still better than the United States, though. I mean,
probably yes, that's true. Probably yes. That's it's just basically a joke everywhere.
Yeah.
But okay, no negative. Okay, positive things now. Okay, what is good about the mainstreaming? Go. What do you like about mainstreaming of the psychedelic renaissance?
I mean, I guess I have a sort of story about this that isn't so grand, but you know, I'm in the Solomon Snyder Department of Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins, and for those of you who are not familiar with who Sol Snyder is, he's, you know, very famous in neuroscience communities. He's probably the living scientist that's had the most citation of any scientist alive. And he, you know, is known because he discovered the opioid receptor and, you know, most of, you know, the dopamine receptor, the serotonin receptor, a bunch of them, right? But he was actually one of the pioneers in psychedelics. And he and Alexander Shulgin used to, you know, Shulgin would make new psychedelics, send them to Sol's lab, and, you know, they would test them on some undergrads, and they'd be like, yep, this one's psychedelic too, you know. And actually he discovered the serotonin 2A receptor, not because he was looking for more receptors, but because he made a radioactive version of LSD, and, you know, discovered that, hey, this is binding to something else that is definitely a serotonin receptor, but not any of the ones that we know of, you know, right now. And that's how the receptor was discovered. And he was, you know, somebody who was very heavily invested in the idea that these drugs could be used as therapeutics. And, you know, with the, you know, 60s and 70s and early 80s, these drugs becoming illegal, those things just kind of all disappeared from the landscape of what was considered a possible therapy. And so, you know, when we kind of figured out what we think is the mechanism underlying these therapeutic effects of psychedelics, you know, he's very old now. He's, you know, but he still comes to lab every day, and he's, you know, around. And when I told him, like, look, it's happening. It's, you know, your dream that someday these would be used for therapeutics is coming true. And you got to see it before, you know, because he was devastated by the loss of this potential therapy. He was so happy. And I gave him a copy of Michael Pollan's book. He was, you know, very happy. And I think that's very heartwarming to, you know, see it coming back, because these are ancient medicines, and it was a major folly of our society to overlook them and get scared of them. And so at least we are coming back to that. So
thank you. And Rose, what are you excited about the most about this mainstreaming that we're experiencing?
Well, I think the potential of psychedelics to awaken in us this sense of interconnectedness of all things. It's so often the message that people get. And actually, I want to reference a YouTube video onto YouTube that I watched today, which is from Akua, which was just amazing and made me cry, and it was so it was called "Can Psychedelics Change Our Racist World Order?" It's so powerful. It's about this idea of the interconnectedness that people can feel, and how that is so needed to to change the very flawed systems that we have. And I do think there is huge potential for psychedelics to change our systems. I think the psychiatric system needs a big overhaul, and I think psychedelics can, probably what I'm most excited about is how psychedelics will, by their very nature, I think, as they incorporate it into psychiatry, alter psychiatry in various different ways because of the nature of them. I think the first is that because of how psychedelics are, because people are so sensitive to the setting, you can't do it in a sterile environment where it's like, I'm the expert, you're there, and I'm just going to leave you alone. It needs warmth, it needs care, it needs a kind of human to human connection, which psychiatry needs. And yes, psychedelics demand that. And they also, in clinical psychology, which is my background, lots of the work, the therapy is very formulaic. You can work sometimes in a really flexible way with a client or a patient for like a long period of time, person to person, really, hearing them and being with them. But most of the time you give people 10 sessions. Because of the long waiting list you refer to, Anya, in the National Health Service, there's such a huge demand. If someone is suffering from depression, they're lucky if they wait for a year and then they're given 10 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy. And that therapy is very manualized. It's all manualized, session 1, session 2. There's worksheets and homework. It's very directive. And I think as psychedelics come in, you can't do it in that directive way because it's so different every time for each different person. So it's going to change psychiatry and psychology in that way. And the third way I think it's going to change it is that lots of our treatments in the kind of Western model are individual. So, this person is depressed. They have a pathology, we give them a pill or we give them a treatment or, whether it's talking therapy, we give them a treatment. The individual takes it and is patched up and made to feel better. But if the roots of our distress are not just about the individual having some internal pathology, but actually about the social structures we exist in, then patching people up in that way is kind of colluding with a broken system. So what I think psychedelics bring in is that psychedelics are often done as ceremonies. They're not just done as an individual. They're done as ceremonies, these healing circles of people. That's the way they've usually been done. They've always been done, really. Not always, but for a very long tradition, they were done in groups, in communities. And I think for integration of psychedelics, psychedelic sharing circles are getting more and more common. That's bringing together a community of people to sit in a circle, take off the mask, be vulnerable, share, be real with each other. For many people, it's the only time in their daily lives that they actually can come and be really authentic with a community of people that have common interests. So I think psychedelics are bringing in this emphasis on the group and sharing circles and community, which in turn, I think will change our communities and then change the root causes of our distress. And so hopefully have a major impact. So yeah, I think psychedelics impact on our sense of interconnectedness that we can experience, but mostly changing the systems, the structures that we exist in, hopefully.
Agreed. Thank you, Ros, so much for this. And we have very little time left because I have only one question now about the bad things. But before I do that, just to ask anybody in the audience that it's a good time to pop your questions now, and I will be reading them as soon as we're done with this round, which will try to be concise and quick. So, Akua, can I start with you again? What bothers you the most in the mainstreaming of the psychedelic renaissance? And maybe if you have an ideas on how we can mitigate those issues, then please tell us as well what we can all do.
I think the only thing that I really worry about is obviously, we live in a world where there is abuse of power. And so psychedelics just becomes another tool in which some people can use to abuse other people. And the only way really to mitigate that is anybody looking for something is to really kind of check in with yourself about where is your power, because there's always going to be abusers, unfortunately. Some people are using, religion, whatever. And this just can become another tool, but that also prompts us to kind of become braver and to look to within, really, to do that kind of work that one has to do. So, it's even with all the profit motive stuff and the big, really expensive retreats, at first they really used to get on my nerves. But then I kind of, like everything, I'm always, nowadays, I just keep thinking, okay, how do we get over it, under it, through it, round it? You know, look for another way. Okay, so maybe you can't afford to go to Peru and take ayahuasca. Well, it's going to be autumn at some point in the year. Go to Wales and, you know, do so. Yeah, I kind of like, think of the problem, but think of the solution that you can do for yourself, really. So yeah, I'm not seeing many problems, but I know there's plenty.
I suppose just to say to US viewers, Wales is where there's loads of cows in UK.
Yes.
I'll put it there. I think everybody gets it from there. So thank you. Thank you so much. Do you mind sharing next about your biggest worry and how to mitigate it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there is a, just disclosure. I have a application in for a patent on an idea of how we're going to use these in a new way. And so I'm not part of the process of, trying to get recognition and intellectual, recognition for my ideas. And I think that's really important, and that, we need to protect creative people in some way. And, patenting and these mechanisms are not perfect, but it's what we have. But on the other hand, I do worry, and I have repeatedly brought this up, about trying to fit psychedelics into the old business model of pharmacology and pharmacological interventions. And my biggest worry is something that sort of we've already touched on in our discussion, is that psychedelics are really very different from other medications when we start thinking about the importance of the setting, right? The context. And so we know that certainly in microdosing kind of regimens, they may have anxiolytic properties, they may have antidepressive properties, they may even have anti-inflammatory properties that can explain these symptoms, relief from like allergies and these other kinds of, or symptom relief from depression. But we know that the sort of macro doses, the big, profound, life-changing experiences that seem to go along with, like complete recovery from PTSD, complete recovery from heroin addiction with Ibogaine, complete recovery from depression, right? Intractable major depressive disorder. These things require and are correlated to the depth of the mystical experience and the context. And my sense is that the way that the drug companies are pursuing psychedelics, they're looking for fast and easy readouts, right? Like markers. And most of the either in vitro or animal studies that are trying to, rush to come up with new molecules, new assays that can, serve as biomarkers for the psychedelic effects, are looking for things that are context independent. And I think that this is, something that's different about our discovery, for example, is that, our reopening of the social reward learning critical period is context dependent. So if you give the MDMA in an isolation context, it doesn't happen, right? And this is hugely important because I think that we have the potential during this renaissance to kind of flood the market with a lot of drugs that are sort of, causing these acute context independent effects. And then all of the enthusiasm for clinical trials is going to dissipate when these things fail, because they fail to capture this incredibly important context dependence of psychedelic action. And so for me, I just, every time I talk to, and I understand why they're motivated to do that. So for example, Johnson & Johnson is very excited about ketamine, right? And ketamine fits their business model perfectly, right? Because it's a drug that you take once and then a week later you have to take it again. It's not this sort of cure where you take it, you have your epiphany, and then you're done, right? And that epiphany model, that one and done model, does not make you the $1 billion you need to recover an investment if they're Johnson & Johnson. So I think that the motivation to pursue the sort of microdose effects or the context independent effects is in line with the business models of big pharma. And so it's going to be hard to keep pushing back and keep insisting that what we're after is the cure, because honestly, someone like me, that's why I'm excited about these. I'm not excited in spending my life, developing the next generation Valium. That's not what I'm interested in, right? I want the cure.
Exactly. I completely agree. And Ross, yours, please tell me.
So my one isn't as original as the other two. And mine was a bit of a kind of like, oh God, everyone's a bit sick of this topic probably, but I still think it's important to say. So I think the thing that really concerns me is, so I totally agree with patenting a creative individual's creative idea. I think that's really important, but kind of napalm bombing patenting tactics that we sometimes see are really quite horrific. So if you've had your own creative idea and it's completely come from you, then yes, you should be able to patent that idea. But what we've seen recently is a company patenting or applying to patent the use of reassurance during a psychedelic session, the use of soft furnishings during a psychedelic session, all these things that like not their ideas, they've extracted from all the other people that have done that work for so long. And so the idea of trying to get patents, and they've tried to get patents, if you look at the applications for patents that this company put in, it's shocking. They've tried every psychiatric condition under the sun. They've literally gone for all of it. And they're not just, they're trying to kind of dominate psilocybin administration completely. And that will have really problematic results. And some people say, oh yeah, but they're never going to get them. But they could, because the people that grant those patents don't necessarily know about this history. And because psychedelic use is illegal, many of the previous uses are not documented. So they can come in and say, yeah, we're the first. And a patent, they might get some of these patents, and that will have a really big implication on research and the future of psilocybin therapy. So, I mean, I won't go into any more detail, but just to give a reference to a really good article, it was in something called motherjones.com, which I'd never heard of. And if you just looked at startup trying to monopolize the astral plane, I mean, it's a bit of a silly title, but if you looked at that article, it really lays out really clearly the problem with this patenting. And I think that's the thing I'm most worried about.
This is, I think, also always has been my biggest worry, and how this will affect accessibility, and is this going to suddenly be just for rich people? Because this is how it's looking here, and the same with there are. Yeah. Anyways, no. I'm not going to complain anymore because we're out of time for complaining. There was a alarm clock for complaints. It's gone now. So I'm going to go to ask questions from the audience. I just want to mention to everyone that I will send you the link and a password to access the exclusive footage of the documentary after this event, and I will give you a week to watch it. So password will not change per week, and there's quite a lot there actually in that footage you'll see about patenting and about our worries and worries of the researchers about accessibility and their own research. Actually, are they going to be able to do their own research if they can't, for example, listen to music on good quality audio or have soft furnishings? But we'll talk about this at another event some other time. So let's go to questions from the audience. What material do you recommend for integration work? I share your belief that integration is key to the healing process, Rosalind. That's from Pedro. Thank you, Pedro.
I've got my mouth full of a sweet, sorry.
Oh, sorry, dear. I didn't see you were munching down there.
It's okay, I'm going to chew it quickly. So So there's just been a book written by Kyle Ortego, Kile, all about integration, covering different kinds of integration. So I'd recommend that book. But yes, absolutely key. As Gul was saying, you know, psychedelics are completely context dependent. And part of that context is the integration. If you don't do the follow-up work, then often the lessons, not always, but often the lessons can kind of dwindle away. So yeah, I think there are loads of different types of integration. The type that I am most interested in at the moment is ecotherapy, as part of a process of connecting to yourself and connecting to the environment, and using the environment as a kind of canvas for your own lessons. So often people feel this sense of flow after psychedelics, synchronicities, this feeling of kind of feeling quite alive. And nature is an amazing canvas for that, because it can be a kind of canvas that you can use it in a creative way. You can engage with it in a creative way. So for example, going into nature to kind of find your intention, or to, because the integration and the preparation kind of go together. So going into nature for the preparation period and thinking of your intention and finding a way of interacting with nature to kind of symbolize that intention, and bring it into the session room and have something from nature that represents this particular intention. And then after the session, going back out into nature and kind of communing with nature in some way, and maybe doing some kind of ritual, or in some way bringing the psychological into the physical, using nature as a canvas. So that probably all sounds a bit niche and strange, but ecotherapy, I think, has got a lot of potential. It's just one of many, many models for doing it. I think another one that looks really interesting to me is internal family systems too. So many psychological models that I think work so well, but the key thing is finding a good integration therapist. There's loads of great ones. Most of them are really booked up. So if anybody is a therapist and wants to become a psychedelic integration therapist, there's a lot of need for psychedelic integration therapists right now. But yeah, Kyle's book, I think, is a great starting point.
Lovely. Akua,
Can I answer?
Oh yeah, I just want to ask you actually.
Yeah, I think integration is so important, and it's so good to have somebody else with you, because I find when I listen to somebody so often after their trip, the most I always see, I'm waiting for the doorway or the door. And that's usually the person's so quick to go past. And it's so important to have someone who's there, dedicated to see that door. And when you point that door out to them and they open it, suddenly all the answers that they didn't even know is what they needed for the question that they brought is there behind that door. And I think, so in a way, as I've got more knowledgeable, I think I'm moving away even from the idea of the journey of the alone into the alone, which, my great invisible mentor now, Kalindi Aye, used to talk about. I feel like somebody like him was on another kind of a journey past the healing stage, maybe. But during the healing stage of working with medicines, I think having somebody who's there just for you, to help you in that first, personally, I believe in a good 4-hour integration after, you've had a trip, a really long, deep one by yourself with one person, to really, really get everything out. And then again, 2 days later, again, a week later, again, a month later, because certain trips are so deep that you can be working on them for 3 months if you keep going back to, hang on, and then this happened and I saw this, what's that about? What does this mean for me? So I think integration is the most important thing. And I actually think people should hold off taking medicine until they found someone who's going to do that job for them, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I totally agree with that. I'm sorry, I know that you guys probably weren't expecting me to have something to say about this since I work with mice, but as a matter of fact, I do have something to say about this. It turns out that I think that integration is where the actual therapeutic action is happening.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that is because in our studies, we didn't even look at the acute effects of the psychedelic, right? What we looked at is we gave the psychedelic in an adult mouse where the critical period for social bonding or reward learning is closed. And then we waited for 48 hours. And then we looked at how they are able to learn from their social environment, this social reward learning critical period. And what we saw is that 48 hours later, they've returned to this level of social reward learning that we only ever see in juvenile animals, right? This learning, this critical period is reopened. And this is unpublished, but I will tell you secretly here, because we're getting very close to submitting the paper, that we have now looked across all psychedelics. And it's not just all psychedelic classes, right? And it's not just MDMA that does this. So ketamine does it, LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and ibogaine all do it. And the duration of the open state of this critical period correlates to the durability of the therapeutic responses, right? So ketamine has a very short acting acute phase, and then the window of therapeutics is closed by a week. Psilocybin and MDMA are like 3 to 5 hours on the acute, and they have slightly longer and are able to address diseases where, you know, the memories are probably a little more ingrained, like PTSD or, you know, alcohol or nicotine addiction. And then ibogaine, which has these incredibly long trips, like, you know, 36 to 72 hours, that has been used successfully for heroin addiction, which is like these incredibly ingrained, recalcitrant, stubborn memories, right, of, you know, addiction, habit learning, right? And so what we found is that ketamine keeps the critical period open for 48 hours, but then it closes by a week. Then psilocybin, then MDMA, then LSD, and ibogaine keeps it open the longest, so like a month. And we haven't actually found an outline, like the date where it's closed again. And so it's really hard to translate between mouse and human in terms of time, but our intuition is that MDMA is going to keep this critical period during which you're doing all this integrating and rewriting those memories and like recontextualizing the traumatic event to the circumstances that are appropriate to you now. That effect lasts for at least 2 weeks in a mouse, which could mean 2 months to 2 years in a human, right? So I think that the effect that we're reporting here really suggests that one of the ways that we need to redesign the clinical trials is to really emphasize how long this period of sort of rewriting those memories, or, you know, that open state of malleability and sensitivity to the world, how durable that is, and that it changes and is more durable with the more durable, more sort of robust psychedelics like ibogaine. So I really think this is a huge part of the therapeutic effect, and we need to really focus on developing strategies to target those memories in a way that takes full advantage of this open state of malleability that the psychedelics are putting the brain in.
This
Fascinating.
This was one of the most badass things I heard, Cole. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for being on this panel.
Let's hope that the reviewers think so too. We'll see.
This was
Amazing.
some deep knowledge there. I'm going to jump to the next question because we have only about 20 minutes, I think, left to answer them, because then Josh, I think, wants to have a last some announcements for Chacruna at the end. So I am about, this is a question, by the way, that I get asked like all the time by people in the Psychedelic Society. I am about to start a degree course in counseling and psychotherapy, but I'm passionate that this is the direction I want to take it. Can you give me any advice on staying involved and also ways to support legalization in my own country where it is still illegal? I'm not sure, Sophie, where you are, a person that asked this question, but in general, what can we all do, people who study counseling and psychotherapy, to stay involved and to support legalization?
one thing that comes to mind is that as there's a huge need for integration therapists. And I wonder whether when people are training in counselling and psychotherapy as trainees, they could offer integration for people in the way Akua is saying, like, give this long, I mean, it would have to be over Zoom probably, but give this long, amazing. I love the idea of like a 4-hour session, like really work with somebody over time, acknowledging that you're a trainee, that you're doing your counselling training, you're not yet fully qualified, but usually during training, you really want case studies, you really want people to work with and learn from. So it wouldn't have to be part of the training, because obviously it's a separate thing, but just if you can spare some time, work with a few people in psychedelic integration, acknowledging you're a trainee, and you'll learn so much and supplement your training that way. Yeah, that's one idea.
Any ideas, ladies?
This time I really have nothing.
I agree with Rosalind.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a lot of integration circles happening around the world.
Yeah.
Maybe approaching people who run those circles, start coming to observe first, but then obviously start helping out. And this is I suppose a good way, right? And I'm sure there are still like, just to add, psychedelics now are really mainstreaming. And if you go on Indeed, I think it's Indeed.com, the job search, there are actually psychedelic jobs there. And I think obviously now you're in training, but maybe there's some kind of assistant or anything, right? Just get, or also like certain universities and studies, they train people to be sitters and things like that. So I suppose those things can be started. Is Synthesis not doing any training as well, Ross? At the moment?
Yeah, there's a training there, but the first cohort's full, but there will be future cohorts as well. You could, but I guess if someone's doing a psychotherapy or counselling training, they probably wouldn't do that. Well, unless they were doing it part-time, but usually doing a counselling training is pretty full on. So you probably wouldn't train to be a psychedelic therapist at the same time, or psychedelic training at the same time as counselling. And I do think there is something to be said for really doing the basic, not the basic, but like the foundational training first and really learning that craft. And there is a tendency, and I'd be exactly the same of like, but I want to just do the psychedelic bit. The other stuff's a bit slow. But I think it's really important to learn those techniques and approaches, and, you know, learning about them, really finding a way, and then having psychedelics kind of adding on the next layer rather than just going straight to it. Because I'm such a believer, therapy is like, good therapy is amazing. Like sometimes in the past I've felt, you know, like I've kind of been a bit negative about therapy, but that's because so often it's not funded properly when you get it through, for example, the National Health Service. It's very short, formulaic, but probably many of us know, like when you get a really amazing therapist and you can really do the work and you can take your time, it's expensive. So expensive, it's so hard to find, but really good talking therapy is amazing. And psychedelics are great and they're brilliant for catalyzing therapy. But I don't think, you know, standard talking therapy, the connection between two people, when you really have that trust, like so important. And so I would say, like, really, really study that and give it your time and energy, and don't see it as second best. See it as absolutely, it's a sacred art to learn. And then adding the psychedelics in when, you know, will be a cherry on the cake, but it's not the whole cake.
Exactly. Great. And yeah, just I suppose integration circle are connection enough.
Yeah.
To this actually, because this is where the whole learning happens. I mean, observing integration circles, even I learned so much. I'm not a therapist, obviously, but just in terms of like how people, you know, what's happening for people and how does that relate to my own thing. So also people go to integration circles, they're just like gems. They're jewels, everybody should go to them.
So often though, the integration circles are so full of people training to be therapists that sometimes you get an integration circle where there's like 12 therapists all wanting to observe, and like one person they're talking about their trip. But like, so there are a lot of therapists, but you know, they are still, I mean, the integration circles are great, yeah. But I really like the idea of long integration, one-on-one, like 4-hour integration sessions. So as well as integration circles, offering like trainee integration one-on-one.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And I mean, just to kind of speak to that point about, the ratio of trainees versus, actual people going through this and the similarities with other types of therapies. When I was in medical school, we were, as part of our psychiatry rotation, we were required to attend either an Alcoholics Anonymous or a Narcotics Anonymous group. And I found, actually, I didn't realize it at the time, but in retrospect, I think that the reason that those therapies work okay, not great, but better than nothing, people will have you believe that it's because you've given yourself over to a higher power, or, you've kind of surrendered yourself. But and I'm coming at this from somebody who studies social behaviors, but, I really felt impressed that what was going on in those groups was that you were becoming responsible to a group and responsible for someone in the group. And it really impressed upon me, one of the things that we think about, for example, for why, why the brain would even have a critical period for social reward learning is because, we want to learn from our social group, but peer pressure and learning in that way is emotionally exhausting. And at some point, we kind of want to follow our own path. But if you could bring that back, that type of social learning in adulthood, you could flip peer pressure and use it for good, right? And, I think that in some sense, that's what these peer facilitation programs are doing. They are sort of using peer pressure for good. And so if there is a component of that to the psychedelic reopening of the critical period for this type of peer learning, then maybe a good way to kind of get exposure to the ways that this is happening, outside of a psychedelic experience is to go and participate in some of these 12-step peer facilitation programs. And I guarantee you, if you live in a city, there's at least one or two. I live in Baltimore, there are dozens of these types of group therapies. And I think you can learn a lot from the way that people help each other.
Definitely. I just want to also say, just because Sophie said here she's from Ireland, Sophie, I'm popping you a link to Psychedelic Society in Ireland run by Chiara Sherlock, our friend. Get in touch with them and they might actually get you involved in some work. So please make sure to do that. Cool. Next question. Okay, this is a good one. I mean, it's a difficult one, but important. Substantial research is going into psychedelic treatment for veterans with PTSD, majority being men, despite higher rates of women enduring PTSD from domestic violence. How can we change this or lessen barrier for women? Heroic hearts equivalent for women? Thank you, Rosie, for this question.
That's a great question. It's a great question. And I think, it's that thing of, as much as I kind of feel like everyone taking radical responsibility for themselves, I also have to acknowledge that actually we live in a society and we have rules and we have leaders and we all agree with that. So it's very hard for the majority of people to take radical responsibility. So then there has to be advocates really to try and change things. I mean, I understand that with this wave of the psychedelic renaissance, they had to kind of start with, a group of people that would be hard for people to argue against. So if you've got lots of people returning from all of these never-ending wars that we have around the world, knowing how to use guns and bombs and being unstable, nobody's going to argue against a radical approach to help them and bring them back to some kind of happiness. So I understand the start of using these medicines for returning people from these wars, mostly men, but definitely I think we have reached the point where it does need to really open up and be beyond the returning soldier kind of story, because you speak to my best friend, looks after, I think it's 3 sort of sheltered homes for women who are escaping violence and different actually types of manipulation. And we were talking just the other day, and she was saying to me, I can't wait until we are able to speak to these women about psychedelics, because you're counseling people knowing that when you speak to her tomorrow, she's going to be back in the same mind state, because actually they're in so much trauma, they're so in fight or flight, they can't literally think straight. So I think the time has really come that we start broadening out the use of psychedelics, and stop talking about just soldiers being the only deserving members of society to have a radical cure for depression and trauma.
Thank you so much, Akua. Anything to add, Gul or Ross?
Yeah, I really agree. I think a lot of the issue with studies is it's all about the funding. So a study will happen. I mean, these kind of clinical studies cost so much money. And up until now, apart from MAPS, many of the other studies that take place in university, certainly where I was, they're based around a donation from a few very, very wealthy philanthropists. So the study will happen in the area that person is interested in. And I know that there are lots of veterans charities, and there's the kind of the funding available for this work. Whereas I don't know about domestic violence for women. I don't know whether it has the same amount of funding. So in order to get a study like this off the ground, we just need a multi-millionaire. And maybe the people that care more about violence to women, domestic violence, are more likely to be women, maybe. And maybe they're not as I don't know. Maybe they're not as likely to be multi-millionaires because they give up so many of their hours to doing, whereas the man might have gained half an hour by being married to a woman.
Absolutely.
And then lost 6 hours by being married to a man. So she doesn't have as much time to make millions. I don't know. But yeah, we need some let's set the intention for some multi-millionaire women to come in and fund some studies looking at issues that are more relevant to women.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I think that's exactly right. That analysis of, because, I've spent the last couple of years trying to fundraise around psychedelics and clinical trials. And, typically it's you sitting in a room with a man and, asking him to be interested in this topic that you are researching. And I'll talk about it in the context of autism instead of psychedelics, because, I think it's important to kind of bring up why it is so problematic to change the model of funding for research from government funded research to privately funded research, right? So when back in the 50s and 60s, when the United States was still very heavily invested in public funding for biomedical research, and also not biomedical research, just science in general, they would donate money for open-ended projects. And like everybody now knows about what a PCR test is because of COVID, right? But the enzyme that is required for the PCR test was discovered because the National Science Foundation funded some scientists to go to Yellowstone National Park, also a federally funded national park, to go and research these weird bacteria that could live at extremely high temperatures. And they discovered Taq polymerase, not because they were going to use it to make a COVID test 40, 50, 60 years later, but because it was just weird and cool and interesting, and how did they survive, right? And that kind of open-ended science funding has been dramatically cut back. And so more and more there is pressure to get funding from private foundations. And the private foundations are great, and they can be a little bit more open-ended than, say, a pharmaceutical company, but the private foundations have names like Cure Autism Now, right? And they are very goal-directed in the way that they are seeking to fund research. And so they are not going to fund a very open-ended project. They're going to fund things that have a clear translational. And then you've got other foundations where, let's say you're studying autism, but the billionaire who set up the foundation really believes in the vaccine theory of autism. And now you have to sort of like gently walk around his beliefs and say, well, the evidence doesn't really support that hypothesis, but, we're happy to add an aim, and it sort of contaminates the process in that way. And I think this is why we need to continue to push our societies to go back to the public funding of science kind of model rather than privatizing research, because the people who have money are going to ask that we study the things that they are interested in, they made money from, or that they can see making money from in the future. And this includes, the Bill Gates and the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos and, all of them. They are interested in certain things because as humans, we're always interested in certain things. And so they are, by their very nature, impossible for them to be democratic the way that a society of scientists who are collectively deciding how to use public funding for science to study whatever scientists think are cool, or whatever, researchers who are, trying to help patients think is the best approach, right? And so this is, I think, a much bigger, not just about women in science, but also democratizing the funding of science, I think will help the whole cause.
Totally. Yes, it's very, and I must say, just to add, as a female filmmaker, very hard to get money. And I know several men who started their documentaries year after me, and they got their money quicker than me, and they finished the films, and mine is still not finished because I don't know why. It's very hard. And I bet if there were women millionaires around the philanthropists, I would have that money by now and this documentary would be out. Or maybe it's good it's not out because now we can cover COVID and more.
Well, but I would just say it's not just about there not being enough women millionaires. I mean, in my personal experience with fundraising, I definitely, I talked about this in the Chacruna interview I did. There is a credibility gap for women, right? When we do things, it's harder for women society, it's not just men, women do it too. Society just has a harder time seeing a woman, accepting a woman as the leader of a creative project, whether it be film or science. We're okay so long as we're the worker bees who are doing all the grunt work, in my case, being a technician, being a postdoc, like all the like day-to-day, actually the work that is getting done. But when you ask people to imagine that you can be, the creative leader, the driving force, they have a hard time imagining it. They have a crisis of imagination. And, I've had people tell me things like, well, that's just too much money for her, despite the fact that, I was at the exact appropriate status of when that funding was available. And, it made me think this is a man who has a tendency to think of women as, spoiled children asking for an allowance rather than leaders or creative, geniuses. Genius is never a word applied to women. It's very, male specific word. And they just have a hard time seeing us that way. And that is another part of the problem that I don't think we should overlook.
I agree, and thank you for we don't have much time, so we can't add to this.
Can I give a 10-second thing? Can I have a 10-second? I just want to give a shout out to my boss, leader, CEO of where I work, Synthesis Institute, Rachel Aiden, who is absolute powerhouse and really, really empowers the women in our organization to really be leaders. So yeah, I just wanted to say that there are some amazing women leaders in psychedelics, and yeah, she does, and it's incredible to work for a woman leader like her because yeah, it's very inspiring.
That was 15 seconds.
That's it.
You owe me 5 seconds. Okay. So just to say, this is more, we don't have much time for questions, but there's one comment that I need to read because actually I feel quite bad that I didn't think of it. And this is so more of a comment than question, but let's not assume all women menstruate. Trans women do not have periods, but are also women. And then in the comments, there was also a comment that's some women who are not trans, they just not menstruate either because of hormonal imbalances. So just to say yes, and I'm sorry for not actually thinking about this. This is real conversation. Yeah. And I think actually, like, obviously representation of trans people in the research is even less, and not just like, facilitators, but also people who go to studies. And this is something we really need to improve on as well. There's going to be different trauma, different problems. And
yes.
So, sorry.
Absolutely.
Cool. I mean, I don't have any more time because Josh will kill me. So I think because it's all that 5 seconds that you stole, Rose. Now we. No, I apologize. It's a light event. We laugh because it's all about lightness and joy in life, and not just about serious stuff. And I just want to say, sorry we didn't go through all the questions. We didn't get a lot, but it was just. It was very rich conversation, and the questions were rich. So we're going to have to just have another event at some point, maybe hosted by me next time. So thank you, Bia, for having us so much.
Yeah.
It was great.
Hey there, everybody. I want to say my 2 words. I want to.
Sorry.
I'm
just going to post in the chat the link to see the footage of the movie. So just people in the chat click and you'll have the password. That's it for me.
Yeah, I wanna thank you and say my 2 words. I want to make a confession that I already confessed that I have a wife back in the day, so that's not a revelation. But yeah, in regards to dating Clancy, and she used to want to take me to women's circles, and I was incredibly like crude. And as a Brazilian that was raised kind of not really open about my sexuality, but I just felt my entire life so incredibly inadequate as a woman. First, because I hate makeup and anything tight, and buying bikinis in Brazil was the most traumatic thing of history of humankind. Like, they just didn't conceive of us with big butts, and it was just so oppressing all my life to try to fit into being a woman in Brazil. And then I moved to Mexico, which is kind of worse than Brazil in terms of gender roles. I used to think, and when I moved in Mexico, I thought, I attended the gym and the women brought so much materials. I thought, wow, there's like a fair. They're selling, beauty products in the gym, like closet, like this, where you change your clothes. And I was telling my mom about it, and it's like, wow, they sell all this produce. Then I found out that there was no fair. They were just, everybody came to the gym with the whole suitcase of produce that they would wear after getting dressed. So I have not been like raised in a way to own my own, like being woman in my own way. And when I met Clancy, and she was from California and the Bay Area and all that, and she would invite me to go to women's circles. And I said, no, I don't want to go to women's circles. That's really boring. I don't like to go to places that there are just women. And she was always like puzzled with me being so crude. And I just thought, well, they're just going to be talking about men and it's going to be so boring. So it took me a whole process, like, to learn, to talk about women issues and to talk about being among women and different ways of being a woman and hanging out with women. I don't think that comes naturally. I think we have to educate ourselves to look at our own gender and our own sexuality. It's not something that it just appears to you. We have to be socialized in that. And I have a great gratitude for the Women's Visionary Congress, where I started to talk about those things in the United States as a foreigner. And they had princesses and all kinds of costumes, and everything was a bit like Burning Man. It was fascinating to me. And I got to learn to talk about women things. And I'm seeing here Wendy, she's in the chat, and she was there, and I attended an event. She had a mustache, and I was like, oh my God, there's a woman with a mustache here. Nobody's talking about it. And then she started her lecture by saying, a woman with a mustache. And I'm like, okay, I'm not seeing, things here. So all of this has been a lifetime for me, myself. To be where I am now, it's more than 10 or 15 years, 20 years to try to catch on, that it's important to talk about all of this, that we need to own all of this, and that we need to create spaces like this so we can exchange among ourselves. And for me now, the next frontier is the business one. So can we try to make our own fundraisings and our own networks? And for those of us that don't like spreadsheets and math and business and all that, accounting, bookkeeping, me, for example, I am an anthropologist. I'm not interested in any of that. How can we master that? How can we master technology and business to create models that are sustainable? And so we can empower ourselves as women. This is what we're trying to do here too, to create this awareness around sexuality, gender, but also empowering ourselves as women and business people and sustainable models. And I also thank, Rachel from the Synthesis Institute. She has been mentoring me a bit in business. I have a few people that are mentoring me to try to overcome prejudice against business, because also depending on men for that is not good. So I hope everybody donates and everybody supports Anya's movie. This is an event, as I said, to support and donate this specific project, help her, and let's bring together this movie. I invite everybody to also keep tuned in Chacruna and to our membership program. If you like our vibe, you like our community, you like what we're trying to do, please become a member and follow us on social media. And I thank all the wonderful men that support us and that are not afraid of powerful women with big mouths, because we just, sometimes are loud, but I think the cool guys, they don't get bothered. And the ones that are insecure, they get really upset. So all my best to the men that are not bothered by powerful women leadership with big mouths, and all the applauses to this wonderful woman with big mouths too. And see you on the other side. Keep tuned. Follow the Chacruna Institute. Much love from the Bay Area. Until the next one, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.